Okay, picking it back up here with guided discussion number 10. Guided discussion number 10 covers primarily chapters 38 and some of 39 as well. It is going to talk about the United States and the war in Vietnam of 1964 to 1973. This is a big one, so it'll probably take me a couple parts, I think. Alright, first thing I want to talk about is the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which was in August of 1964. President Johnson, when he got into office, continued President Kennedy's uh, policy of sending military aid and advisors to Vietnam, but he was under pressure to do more, especially since he was being criticized by Barry Goldwater in the election of his opponent, Barry Goldwater, in the election in 1964. Johnson got his chance to be tough on Vietnam when the Gulf of Tonkin affair occurred. On August 2nd of 1964, North Vietnamese torpedo boats attacked the American destroyer, the Maddox, in the Gulf of Tonkin. Now, the torpedo boats missed completely. In response, the Navy sent in another destroyer, the C. Turner Joy. On the evening of August 4th, the sonar and radar equipment of the Maddox and the C. Turner Joy indicated torpedoes were being fired, this time at both boats. It is questionable to this day whether the ships were even being attacked, and later investigation concluded that the North Vietnamese gunboats had not attacked American ships. This is later on when they determined that it didn't happen. But for the time being, at that time, in response to the supposed attack, President Johnson ordered airstrikes against North Vietnamese naval bases. In addition, Johnson wasted no time in sending to Congress a resolution known as the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which gave the President authority to essentially take all necessary measures to repeal any armed attack against the forces of the United States and to prevent further aggression. So again, the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution gives the President the authority to take all necessary measures to repeal any armed attack against the forces of the United States and to prevent further aggression. This way, Johnson essentially could commit U.S. troops to Vietnam without getting a formal declaration of war from Congress. Johnson later said that the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution was kind of like Grandma's night shirt. It covered everything. Alright. The Vietnam War, fought by the U.S. from 1964 to 1973, involved the U.S. military and the ARVN, the South Vietnamese Army, against the VC, the Viet Cong, and the NVA, the North Vietnamese Army. The major goal of the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong was to overthrow the communist government of South Vietnam and unify all of Vietnam into one communist country. The goal of the U.S. and the ARVN was to prevent this from happening. Starting in 1965, we're on to escalation in Vietnam now. Starting in 1965, President Johnson adopted a policy later called Escalation. Not really a safe policy at all. I don't know why I said safe, but it's called Escalation. Basically, this policy states that President Johnson would keep sending more and more troops into Vietnam in order to keep the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese Army from taking over South Vietnam. The idea was that if the U.S. just sent more troops, then the U.S. would win. That seems simple. Heavy bombing of the North Vietnam also was part of this, as they were supplying the VC, the Viet Cong, who were in the south. So the NVA and the North Vietnam were supplying the VC, the Viet Cong, who were in the south, trying to take on the ARVN and of course the U.S. Fighting the Viet Cong or the VC was difficult for U.S. soldiers because of their guerrilla warfare tactics. Some of the tactics that they used included the VC would wear civilian clothing. The VC would engage in hit-and-run attacks. The VC could easily hide and plan attacks in their large networks of tunnels. When fired upon, the VC would often not fire back. The VC traveled lightly and carried few supplies. And the VC used a large number of booby traps and landmines. The Vietnam War was not about gaining land. As Vietnam veteran Winston Groom, author, who actually wrote Forrest Gump, wrote in his novel Better Times Than These, he said, so much the killing seemed meaningless. It was take one hill, move on the next 2 days, move on to the next 2 days later. The enemy has had what we had got back again. It was killing for killing's sake. Leading the fight against the Viet Cong was General William Westmoreland, W-E-S-T-M-O-R-E-L-A-N-D, Westmoreland. He was the commander of the American forces in South Vietnam. Westmoreland's strategy was to take over land. Was not to take over land. I repeat, his strategy was not to take over land. It was about attrition. Attrition meaning we're just going to outlast the enemy. The reason why this did not work was because killing so many of the enemy that they no longer had the ability or the willpower to fight. In doing this, the U.S. emphasized daily the body count. How many VC were killed each day. It didn't work because the North Vietnamese seemed able to recruit a seemingly endless supply of new soldiers to replace those that were killed. So in part of this policy of attrition, again, was to kill as many of the enemy and so that they would no longer have the ability or the will to fight, but they totally underestimated the ability of the South Vietnamese, the North Vietnamese to recruit soldiers. Alright, we're going to stop right there for part 1 of guide discussion number 10.